Hi, my name's Jennifer and welcome back to my channel. It's lovely to have you here. This is my November wrap up. So I read a total of 16 books in November. There's a nice variety. There's a couple of short story collections, a little bit of non-fiction, some translated fiction, a few new releases, and some YA as well. So I'm going to start off by talking about the short story collections that I read. The first one is an anthology, which sadly the vast majority of you are not going to be able to read yourselves, even if you want to. And I'll explain why. And that is Novels That Shaped Our World, an anthology of short stories, Wirral and Sefton. So what this is during August 2020, a 8-week creative writing course took place, funded by Arts Council England, and in conjunction with Sefton Libraries, which is where I live, and Wirral Libraries, which is actually where I'm from originally. And at the culmination of that 8-week creative writing course, the participants were asked if they wanted to submit a short story. And the libraries then compiled those short stories into this book. And this book, as far as I'm aware, cannot be bought. It only exists in the library catalogues of Sefton Libraries and Wirral Libraries. So, there's actually 40 short stories in this book, and it's not that long, so they are very short stories. And I just thought the standard of writing in these stories was really, really good. I actually gave this 4 stars, and I'm telling you that because with short story collections, particularly where there's a number of authors that have written the stories, typically I'll give them 3 stars because some I like a lot more than others. But this, I actually gave 4 stars. I was really quite astounded by the level of writing of these stories. Some of the stories were set against the backdrop of the pandemic, which makes sense because they were all written last year. And even though they weren't necessarily about the pandemic, but a few of them had the pandemic as the backdrop. So, for example, one of the stories follows a woman who is working from home because we're in lockdown, and she's doing lots of online meetings, and there's a new person at work, and we see her start to emulate this new person as she sees her on camera with the jewellery that she's wearing and so on. Overall, the standard of stories I thought was really, really high, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. So if you do happen to live in Sefton or on the Wirral and you have a library card, then I highly recommend that you check this out. I love everything about this book. I love the whole concept of it. I love where it came from. I think it's brilliant. I think it just shows how great our libraries are. The next short story collection that I read, I was less keen on. This is The Mistletoe Head and Other Stories by P.D. James. I think I have read this before several years ago. There's only 4 short stories in here. They are all set at Christmas. They are all pretty dark, which I like. I like dark. But overall, I wasn't overly keen. I liked the story called A Very Commonplace Murder the most. That one follows a man who is sort of watching a relationship play out in the building over the way from where he works. So it's a little bit Rear Window-esque, and that one has quite a dark ending. There's one story which is, I'm laughing, but where the patriarch of a family dies by suicide on Christmas Day, and he has laid himself out on his bed with a Christmas hat on and a mouthful of Christmas pudding, and he's left this suicide note, which I will quote some of. No more ridiculous paper hats, no more of your repellently ugly faces and mind-numbing companies. I'm entitled to some peace and happiness. Merry Christmas. So yeah, overall, it was alright. I wasn't overly fussed on it. Right, let's talk about a little bit of non-fiction because this was fabulous. This is Manifesto by Bernardine Evaristo. So this is Bernardine's memoir. She recounts her life, her growing up. She was born in London to a large family. She's got a lot of siblings. Her mother is white and her father is black. So she talks about growing up biracial, how that has affected her education, her career, how her racial identity has influenced the decisions that she has made throughout her life in terms of deciding where her work and career were going to go, where she was more likely to be able to get more opportunities because of her race. And so not because of her race, but she was aware that there were certain paths that if she had chosen them, she would most likely not struggle to get through because of her race. She talks about her relationship. She talks about a particular relationship she had with a woman who was very, very controlling. She talks about her writing. She talks about her writing process and how when she the relationship between verse and poetry and prose, and how some of her earlier novels had started out in a completely different format and then she totally reworked them in a different way. She won the Booker Prize 2 years ago for Girl, Woman, Other, and she talks a lot about how she uses her voice and her platform that she now has. People now really know who she is and listen to her, and she uses her voice for good to lift up other people, lift up other Black authors. This was a really fascinating read. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Highly recommend. Okay, next let's talk about a reread. I don't do a lot of rereading, it's something I want to make more time for. This is The 13th Tale by Diane at Setterfield. So I read this several years ago and I really, really loved it. So it has a bit of a gothic feel to it. So we follow a young journalist who has been asked by an older writer to go and write this writer's biography, her life story. This writer is quite reclusive, lives in a big old house, has given interviews in the past, but has always told each person that she's spoken to like a completely different story. So it's quite clear that she's just like making it up and no one really knows her story. There was quite a lot about this book that I had actually forgotten. Like I thought I remembered the plot and how things went, and I did kind of remember some of it, but actually there was really quite a lot that I had completely forgotten. So I very much enjoyed reminding myself of that. I think this is a really well written book. It's a little bit longer. I think it's a good book for this time of year when, well, depending where in the world you are, when the days are shorter. So on the dark nights you can just get cozy and delve into it. And it's a great like mystery, the way things are revealed. We get some stuff from the journalist's backstory as well. Yeah, thoroughly enjoyable. Okay, let's next talk about, where should we go? Right, let's talk about a little bit of crime fiction. This is For Your Own Good by Samantha Downing. So this is set in a school and we follow a teacher called Teddy who is a bit of an odd character. He is he sets himself very high standards. He has very high morals in his opinion, but he is very judgmental of other people, of the other teachers at the school, and people start to die in suspicious circumstances. There are a lot of suspicious characters in this book as we go through, and quite unlikable people, and there's lots of different like elements to the mystery. I read this right at the start of the month and I can't actually remember what happens in the end, and I don't have a very good memory, so that is probably my fault, but also I think it was probably fairly forgettable. I don't think the writing was great, but it was quite an enjoyable read. Next let's talk about The Night Tiger by Yangsze Show. So I was recommended this book by Gemma from Gem of Books. I'll link Gemma's channel down below, and Gemma recommended this to me as a book that she thought I would like, and I did. So thank you, Gemma. What I love about this recommendation is that I don't think this is a obvious choice for me. When I picked this up from the library, I really wasn't sure what I was going to think of it, but I started reading it and pretty much by like page 2 I was like, yes, this is exactly my kind of book. There was something about the writing something about the writing, certainly to start with, and maybe even the setting in a way, even though it's a different setting, that put me in mind of Sarah Waters and particularly Fingersmith. So what's this about? It's set in 1930s Malaya, and we follow an 11-year-old houseboy called Ren, whose master has just died. And his master has died without a finger. So his finger has been severed some time ago. But so Ren has to go find his master's finger, reunite it with his master's dead body, so that his master's soul can go free. So that's one narrative strand. The other is Ji Lin, who's a young apprentice dressmaker, also moonlights as a dance hall girl. And one night when she is working in the dance hall, she discovers in one of the client's pockets, I think, a severed finger. So that's the second narrative strand. So it's set in 1930s Malaya, and it's set across this like myth or rumour of a tiger or tigers who turn into men. As we go along in the plot, the two narrative strands do converge, and there is elements of the book which are quite thriller-esque. It gets quite page-turning, certainly towards the end, which I very much enjoyed. I think it's really well written. I think the characters are well developed. My only slight criticism was that for me there was a few too many characters at certain points, but that's because I struggle if there's more than like 3 characters. I lose track of who's who. So that's totally my fault, not the book's fault. But yeah, I really enjoyed this book, so thank you very much to Gemma. Okay, next we have Bewilderment by Richard Powers. So this book was shortlisted for this year's Booker Prize, and having read it, I can completely see why it was shortlisted. I liked it a lot. It's not my favourite of the shortlist, but I definitely liked it. So Bewilderment follows a young boy called Robin. I think he's 9 years old, and his father. His mother has died, I think, a year or two before, and obviously he's still grieving for his mother. Robin is in some way neurodivergent, and his father, so Robin's been either diagnosed or potentially diagnosed with a few different conditions, like I think Asperger's, ADHD and OCD, but his father doesn't hold much sway by these diagnoses. His father is an astrobiologist, and Robin is very, very interested in the universe, in whether life can exist on other planets. Throughout the novel, it's interspersed with his father imagining planets that could exist out there and what life is like on those planets, and talking to Robin about it. And those little imaginary bits I really, really enjoyed. I thought they were really good. Robin also has a very keen interest in conservation, in preservation of our planet, which plays out throughout the book. My interest waned somewhat when we got to the second half of the book for some reason, but by the end it picked up. I think the ending of this book is really, really strong. I really liked it. I wasn't quite expecting where it went. And I think this book is one that I'm likely to think about quite a lot in future, which I think is always a sign of a good book. Okay, next I read Swimming Home by Deborah Levy. I read this for my reading group that I belong to at the library. This was my selection of book. We are restricted in our book selection by the reading group sets that the library has. So I chose this because it was a book I'd heard people talk about and want to read it. It's from a few years ago, and it was shortlisted for the Booker Prize. I like this because it's quite a tight focus novel over quite a short period of time. There's not too many characters, and it's quite a sort of reflective novel. So this is about a couple who go on holiday with their daughter, who's a teenager, to Nice, and they're staying in this villa. There's another couple there as well who they know, and then this young woman appears So it seems that the villa has somehow either been double booked or she'd been told she was going to be able to stay there. She's stayed in this villa before. I think they all like know the owner or something. Anyway, she turns up. She's then got nowhere to stay, and so they end up allowing her to stay with them in the villa. This young woman, is seemingly quite troubled. She often like appears just like naked in front of people. She is very admiring of the father in the family. So the father is a poet, a famous poet, and she is a big admirer of his work. And she feels that she has a special connection with the father character through his poetry. It's clear so we know right from the start that there is going to be some sort of connection, relationship that develops between this young woman and the father of the family that's staying in the villa. And then we flash back and we see how that plays out. The young woman, as I say, is clearly quite troubled. She's had mental ill health, I think, in the past. The depression is a theme that runs throughout the book. I think it's handled well. I really like the ending of this book, even though overall, I mean, there's quite a lot of misery in here, I'm not going to lie, but I liked it. I mean, I thought it was done really well. I'll be interested to see what my reading group think of this, because we haven't met yet. We're meeting next weekend. My prediction is that there might be one or two people who like it, I think, knowing their tastes, but I suspect a fair few people probably will not like it, and they will probably not like the generally fairly unlikable characters in this book, but it's something that I quite like. Let's go on to some translated fiction next. So first up we have Newcomer by Keigo Higashino, which is translated from Japanese by Giles Murray. So this is a crime novel. I've read a couple of books by this author before and really enjoyed them. This one is quite unusual in its structure and form. So the overall narrative, sort of the overall plot, is that we've had a murder. A woman's been brutally murdered in her apartment and it's being investigated. But what we have is the detective is trying to figure out seemingly irrelevant minor details to do with this murder. So things that he's found in the woman's apartment or whatever, and he's trying to explain it. So most of these little things turn out to be pretty irrelevant to the murder, but he's trying to figure out what they all mean so he can work out for himself then what is relevant. It almost feels like short stories or interconnected short stories. Not quite, but almost. So we've got the book is told in different sections, and so some of the section headers are the girl at the rice cracker shop, the clock shop's dog, a friend of the translator. So we follow different aspects of the mystery, and we see the detective talking to people involved and trying to figure out what each of those things mean. And there's almost a strangely light-hearted's the wrong word, but a lot of those aspects turn out to be, you know, he's delving into relationships between people and little secrets they have, like little family secrets or little things, and it was almost slightly incongruous then when we come back at the end. We do find out like who the murderer is, you know, that is all revealed, and so there's a slightly odd juxtaposition of these sort of short stories, not quite short stories, but short little excerpts, which have a not gritty flavour at all, and then to round back to the overall murder. I was kind of like not that interested in the overall murder by the end, and that I guess is not really the point of the book. It is more about looking at these other little elements of the mystery to be solved. But overall, I enjoyed it. I didn't enjoy it as much as the other books I've read by this author. I've read Malice and I've read The Devotion of Suspect X. Have I made that up? Is that what it's called? Yes. And I like those both very much. So I like this, although not as much as I've liked his other works that I've read. Okay, next we've got some more translated fiction. This is Lemon by Kwon, Yeo-sun, and this is translated from Korean by Janet Hong. So this is great. This is an odd little book. This is framed around the murder that took place, I think, like 20 years earlier, of a 19-year-old girl, Kim Hyeon, and it becomes known as the High School Beauty Murder. And throughout this book, we have 3 different perspectives, looking back at what's happened and the impact on other people's lives. So one of the main perspectives is from Kim Hyeon's sister, and then we get 2 perspectives from people who I think were both classmates of Kim Hyeon. The murder was never solved, so there was a couple of people who were interviewed by the police in connection with it, but no one was actually convicted of the murder. The different narrative voices throughout is interesting because in each different section, it's not always clear straight away who the narrator is for that section. So it might take you like a few pages to figure out who that is. And this book, I would say, is it's not so much about like solving the murder. It's about the impact of that on other people left behind and what plays out as a result of that. The author never leaves it all out on a plate for you. There is some ambiguity in the book, and when I got to the end, I was kind of like, what? And I had to look up some of the reviews, and then I was thinking about it, and then the penny dropped. And I think, and I'm not going to give anything away, but I think I think it is probably quite clear by the end who we think the murderer is, although that, as I say, is not entirely, I think, the point of the story. There are breadcrumbs scattered throughout, which I think indicate that there's another mystery going on in the background here as well, as a result of the murder. And I think this book is very quietly clever. It's a book that I would definitely like to reread at some point. When I got to the end of it, I kind of almost wanted to go back and read it all over again, but I didn't. But yeah, I think it will definitely merit a reread at some point. I think it's a very clever book. I think there's a lot going on. I think it's a book that I will probably think about quite a lot. Now for another relatively recent new release. This is Case Study by Graeme, Macrae, Burnet. So, I've previously read his Budgie Project by this author, and I liked that. I think Graeme, Macrae, Burnet does something very interesting in how he blurs the line between fiction and non-fiction. This is fiction, but it is presented as non-fiction. So, what this is... So, this is set in London in the 60s, and we follow a woman who believes her sister was driven to suicide by her psychotherapist. So, in the book, the author tells us that he was sent diaries of this woman who believes her sister was driven to suicide. So he sent these diaries. He sent them by a relative of this woman. And so the diaries recount this woman who then assumes another identity and then goes to see this psychotherapist as a patient herself to get to know him, to understand more, to try and sort of figure out what really happened to her sister. And then the book is interspersed with these biographical sections where Graeme, Macrae, Burnet recounts the life of this psychotherapist. So it's told as if he's a real person, and it's presented as fact rather than fiction. There are interesting narrative layers in the story, I think, in terms of, so with the diary, for example, so we've got a woman who's written the diary, and we don't necessarily know like the circumstances under which she's written it. This is her account of what's happened, and then the diaries have been sent by a relative of this woman who's found them to Graeme Macrae Bennett, who is then presenting them in this book. So I think when you read it, you're very conscious that the story has gone through a lot of hands before it comes to you. Mental ill health is a big part of the book, and for me, there were certain times when I didn't entirely feel comfortable with how things were being portrayed. I feel like I say that a lot, but yeah, that was just how I felt on reading it. So I do think Graeme Macrae Bennett is a really interesting author. I think he does something really interesting in the blurring of fact and fiction. He did that as well with his Bloody Project. So yeah, an interesting author, even though I don't necessarily always quite get on with his work, but it's definitely worth a read. Okay, another recent release that I read last month was Burntcoat by Sarah Hall. This is a pandemic novel. So our main character is called Edith, and she is a sculptor, and we know at the start of the novel she is looking back on her life and she believes her life is soon to come to an end. It's set against the backdrop of the pandemic. It's not COVID, but it is, the circumstances are all quite similar to the COVID pandemic. A lot of the novel, she is in lockdown, and she has developed, so she develops a relationship, but very, very early on in the relationship, they end up living together through lockdown. It's told in quite a sparse style, I would say, short sort of snapshots, and sometimes that can work for me. I'm not sure I quite connected with this. There's quite a lot of sex in this novel, and I found it kind of cringe, actually, so that just kind of put me off a little bit. Overall, I feel like it was mostly written quite well, apart from the sex scenes for me. And I wouldn't be surprised if this is nominated for next year's Booker Prize. So Sarah Hall has been nominated twice before for the Booker Prize, so this is not like a wild prediction. But I think, even though this didn't quite work for me, I can appreciate what it's doing, and you heard it here first. I think this will be on the long list for next year's Booker Prize. Okay, next we have Box Hill by Adam Mars Jones. This was my favourite book that I read last month. This is quite a difficult read in parts, well, for the most part. This is about Colin, who is looking back and reflecting on his relationship with Ray. So Colin meets Ray when Colin is 18. Ray's older. He literally falls over him in a park. Ray's sitting up against a tree. Ray's a biker. He falls over him, and what ensues is a sexual relationship, which commences pretty much immediately. That very same day, Colin moves in with Ray. One of the first sexual encounters they have is described by Colin as being non-consensual, and then what develops is a dominant submissive relationship, and it's quite brutal in parts. As you're reading it, you do feel quite uncomfortable. It's not entirely clear, and I guess this is kind of the point, whether Colin has consented, to what extent Colin has consented. He continues to live with Ray for quite a long time. It makes for uncomfortable reading. It's really, really well written. The subtitle of the book, I should say, is A Story of Low Self-Esteem, and I think that sums up Colin really well. There were, for me, certain echoes of Jude from A Little Life in this. It's not the same story, but the characters just it just reminds me a little bit of Jude. For me, the second half, I think I actually preferred when we get more of Colin's reflections, impact on Colin's life, and so on. So yeah, I really enjoyed, feels like the wrong way to say, this was the best book I read last month. I imagine it's probably not going to be for everyone because it is quite like brutal in some of what's described, but it's a really, really excellent book. Now for something quite different, let's head to some YA. This is The Henna Wars by Adiba Jaigirdar. This is a book I've wanted to read for a little while and finally got around to it. So in this book we follow Nishat, who is 16 years old. She lives in Dublin with her family, and right at the start of the book she comes out as gay to her parents, and her parents do not react well to this news. And in particular, they are worried about what their family in Bangladesh will think. So it's not so much what they think, it's they're worried about what other people will think. And then Nishat at school is outed as being gay. I think like a group text is sent outing her. She doesn't know where that's come from. So we see the impact that has on her to have had that choice to come out publicly being taken away from her. A key part of the novel is, and where the title comes from, The Henna Wars, is through their business studies class. They have to like set up a business idea, and Nishat's idea is to do henna, which she has, I think she's learned from her grandmother. It's part of her culture, but some other girls at the school decide to set up a rival henna business at the same time, including Flavia, who Nishat actually has a crush on. So they set up this rival business, and Nishat is understandably, totally offended and angry at this because of cultural appropriation, because of how they are using her culture just to, profit from it. And it's explained really well in a really sensitive way. And what we see is Flavia in particular, who Nishat has a crush on and who is part of this rival henna business. Flavia doesn't understand until Nishat explains to her why Nishat's so upset about this, what it means to her. It is a bit of a enemies to lover trope, but it's done really well. It's a really well written book, great characters, and it's a book that I think should be in every school library. Next up is another book which I've wanted to read for a little while. This is Freshwater by Akwaeke Emezi. So, earlier this year I read The Death of Vivek Oji, which I adored. And I read Pet as well, which I very much liked a lot. So this Freshwater is Emezi's debut novel. We follow Ada, who is mostly described throughout the book as the Ada, who is a Obanji, I hope I've pronounced that right, who has spirits living inside of them, and a lot of the chapters are told from the perspective of we, so it's the spirits speaking. They talk about how they are living inside the Ada. Certain chapters are told by one spirit in particular, Asugara, who I guess can become dominant at certain points, in particular in terms of Ada's sexual relationships. Asugara steps to the forefront at those points. I found this really fascinating, and I know my understanding is that Akwaeke Emezi identifies as Obanji themselves, in terms of having spirits inside of them. And I really want to read Dear Sentharan, which is Emezi's memoir, because I'd like to understand a bit more about that, about what that means. I can see why some people don't quite get on with this. It did take me a little bit to get into the flow of it. And again, I think this is a book which will merit a reread at some point as well. And then the final book that I read is A Pale View of Hills by Kazuo Ishiguro. This is another debut novel. This is Ishiguro's debut. I'm sort of working my way through the backlist. I think I've got two or three books left to read by Ishiguro. This is an odd little book. So our main character is Atsuko, who is a Japanese woman living in England, and reflecting on the suicide of her daughter. She has another daughter as well, and we flash back to another female character who Atsuko used to know, and that character's daughter, who like keeps running away, and it's all a little bit odd. Throughout the novel, certainly I had a sense of something being a little bit off, like tension, like where is this going? Like, you know it's going somewhere, but you don't quite know where it's going. When I got to the end of the book, I was kind of like, what? I liked it. I think, again, this is another book that will merit a reread at some point. I love Ishiguro's writing. I don't know what it is about his writing, but I just love it. And I do like how he writes about memory. He has said himself that all of his books are pretty much about the same thing. He just presents them in a different setting. And I think that's what I really like about Ishiguro's novels and the themes that he explores. So I definitely liked it. It's not my favourite Ishiguro book. It's one that I will reread at some point. And I'm pleased that I read it. So that is my November wrap up. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you're all doing well, and I'll speak to you all again very soon. Bye.